So again, thanks, Renata and Francisca for organizing the event. I'm very happy that we managed to discuss a bit of practice-based activities in pedagogy, which is what I will try to do today, discussing the experience in fashion studies pedagogy in relation to my work. Very briefly, I will mention something that I did at the Center of Fashion Studies at Stockholm University, and mainly focusing on the two experiences that I developed at Parsons Paris, where I founded and I currently direct the MA in Fashion Studies. To do this, I will focus on I will pay particular attention to the relation between theory and practice, looking at different type of practices and also the very practice of teaching. I start with this quote, which is by Marc Monjou, who is a French designer theorist, who published this article earlier, but then it was republished in the last issue of Azimuth, which is a French publication on research and design. And he says, everything happens as if theory could be only defined negatively in relation to practice. Everything happens as if a concept and a theory can only be stated in a textual expression. Here, Monjou is really looking at recent evolution in the discourse about design practices and education. And he's really referring to a recent attempt, especially in design and performance studies, to merge theory and practice, and which has often led to discussion about the ways to couple two terms that have been often defined as two opposites. In the article, Monjou continues reflecting on how there is still a common impulse to position the theory and practice as two contraries, creating, once coupling these two terms together, a sort of oxymoron. That is what I mentioned in my title, that I would like also to surpass, or at least think forward in relation to more hands-on discussion on pedagogical activities that indeed aim to bridge these two terms, but at the same time brought me to face a lot of different challenges, both in terms of bureaucracy in institutions and also pedagogical terms. Of course, we need to say that it's important to remember that theory and practice is a very extremely fashionable formula that has been emerging in very different and used in very different academic fields. And without going back to Aristotle or the kind of distinction between praxis or techne and other works, we can I would like to say just a few words about the contemporary academic discourse that could really be placed on a very early discussion on the sort of spaces in between, where theory and practice started to be really put together with, and I think with the advent of courses in theater, dance, and performing arts during the 70s. I think in Europe, for example, of dance at the University of Bologna, of course, but also with the integration of design and art schools inside the university system with the Bologna system. This transformation in the politics and hierarchies of higher education has started a discourse on the academic relevance of artistic practices that, in connection with the merging of semiotics and cultural studies, of course, created a perfect environment for the discussion on the relation to practice and theory. And I also argue with fashion studies as well, with the advent of fashion studies afterwards. This radical shift did not only see a sort of elevation of practice in academic discourses, but have conversely put traditional theory into a state of crisis. Here we see in September 2009, Frieze magazine dedicated an entire issue to the role of theories in art design schools, provocatively asking the question, what happened to theory? Denouncing a crisis of theory in contemporary art design schools. In its editorial, Sam Form stressed the importance of not only initiating critical theory in practice-based education, but it also denounced the need to rethink the way in which we do theory, while also avoiding simplification of theory in academic and artistic circles, observing, and I'm quoting, how the banal and aporious and unnecessarily populate press releases and catalog essays. These words resonate in today's fashion scenario. While the expansion of fashion education may help us to raise the cultural value of fashion, it may also dangerously concur in its simplification, and at a time when the fashion industry itself is employing the languages and codes of critical discourses and even critical theory and activism. If a move from academia to popular culture may represent a landmark for the scope of cultural theory, we must remind us, as Thorne stresses, how it might be things into question, especially theory. Angela McRobbie goes back to these issues in her book Be Creative, where she denounced a complete absorption in media and creative industries of a countercultural critique by capitalism in its post-Fordist phase. And she stressed, and I'm quoting, "What has been unexpected is the way in which cultural studies has become the privileged conduit for this double and paradoxical movement of instrumentalization and politicization." End of the quote. These words strongly resonate when we think of fashion studies, which have been mainly exploring questions of theory and practice in relation to fashion design pedagogy and research, paradoxically becoming more inclined to this sort of instrumentalization denounced by McRobbie. In design education, we could say that fashion studies have replaced cultural studies and often employed and have been often employed to push mainly designers, so not other practitioners, to critically look at design practices and system of production and consumption. While all this discussion has stimulated a large debate on the potential of fashion studies in pushing design education towards issue of equity and inclusivity in design curriculum, here I'm thinking about the manifesto by Timo Rysanen or even Ben Berry, it has also recently brought a more outspoken discussion, and I think this conference is a very clear example, of the needs to develop a discourse about theory and practice within fashion studies education as a field belonging to social sciences and humanities, where the seminar-based classes, readings, discussion, and writings have been the main learning activities. This tendency has recently changed with the emergence of theory-based curriculum in art and design school, and the program I am directing is one example, and with increasing attention towards question of positionality and decoloniality, pushed by academics to rethink the ways practical activities in our classroom may not only affect our student experience and experiential learning at large, but also may help to expand theoretical speculation in the field. However, it is important to remind us that the discussion is not completely new, as cultural anthropology and especially the use of ethnographic method have in many ways advanced the discussion on both self-reflexivity and research method, and even a more theoretical discussion about practice as a concept. This perspective is, for example, what I tried to develop with my colleague Andrea Kolnitz at the Center of Fashion Studies in 2012 and 2013, when we started a course titled Contemporary Fashion Practice and Theory. And this was to reflect on the ways practice, here intending mainly in relation to fashion industry practices, can challenge theory, forcing us to rethink predetermined theoretical framework, as you can read from this quote by Michel de Certeau. The idea was to work on a foundational text in fashion studies, exploring this text in collaboration with the practitioners, a designer, a photographer, a stylist, a buyer, who were all invited to share their work, but also discuss the reading with us and further follow students' writing processes. While the reception of students was very high, we encountered difficulties in experimenting pedagogically with a more classical university structure. We in fact encountered difficulties in terms of grading and assignment, as we tried to employ studio-based sessions, but were confronted with bureaucratic restriction that did not favor the involvement of industry figures who could be hardly paid for their engagement. My work at the MA in Fashion Studies at Parsons Paris tried to overcome some of these difficulties. Just to give you a bit of context, I started the program in 2016, which was at Parsons Paris, which is one of the 6 colleges under the umbrella of the new school. The program was a sort of sister, we could say brother program, of the New York program that was established in 2010 under the guidance of Eike Jens and Hazel Clark, and then also under the directorship of Francesca Granata and Christina Moon, who I also want to thank for the amazing support they gave me at the beginning of my work at Parsons Paris. And really, when I started the program, I was basically asked to respect the structure and the main concourses that were developed in New York, but I could also give an inflection, of course, on content and creation of courses that could better suit the geographical context, Paris and Europe, and the institutional context, which was Parsons Paris in itself, which was a sort of extension of the College Parsons in New York, with mainly studio-based programs, no library, and very little resources in terms of social sciences and for a social science and humanities program. The body of students was, and it is still now international, gathering students from North and South America, Eastern, Western Asia, Europe, and North Africa. And after my interview with candidates, it became very clear how they were indeed interested in what they thought is fashion studies, but they were also very interested in developing careers in industry and cultural institutions. And of course, there was a will coming to Paris. There is always a big capital there. This aspect, in combination to the very nature of the school, naturally led me to build a program with a clear attention to a mixture between traditional liberal art classes and practice-based activities, mainly focusing on developing relation with the industry in the field of creating and media. And this was mirrored also by the faculty recruitment that I oversees, that create a mix between academics like me or Malang, and practitioner like the artist and editor Oxymoron, the collector Antoine Boucher, and the curator Laurent Cotin. The ambition was really to occupy the spaces of seminar-based classes with non-traditional seminar-based learning activities. And this, I believe, was also possible due to the small size and to some extent, little institutional control on us. So this sort of freedom allows us to mix in an academic program theories and practitioners to stress how the relation between praxis and theory may be also reduced to a sort of performative physical presence of academics in studios, but also of designers or other practitioners in seminar-based classes. Something that I think would be very interesting to further discuss in relation to interdisciplinary co-teaching practices. So using exhibition or magazines as final assignment for liberal art classes, these pedagogical approaches do not necessarily reside in a social science or humanities tradition, but were led by an interest in hybridizing pedagogical techniques, usually belonging to studio-based practices, so revision, external juries, workshop, and use them inside the seminar-based technique. So I pass now to the two projects that I wanted to present. The first one is called I'm Making the Digital Fashion Image. And it's a good example of how we tried and the struggle also we had in combining practice with theory. Practice of mainly relation is really defined as a sort of relation with an industry. So I'm not looking at other type of practices that maybe we can discuss in the common discussion. And really the idea was to unpack theoretical questions on fashion mediation. So practice really was used in that sense. The project was developed in the fall 2018, and it was a result of a collaborative work between 3 different courses, which ran at the same time. One was Critical Theory and Fashion that I was teaching, another one Fashion History and Mediation by Antoine Boucher, and a course titled Fashion System and Global Perspective that I co-taught with Giulia Mersitieri. Sharing both literature and course session, the idea was I wanted really to explore the necessity to think collaboratively, to think theory through practice and history simultaneously and between courses, as a way to overcome the dichotomy or even oxymoron of practice and theory, as I mentioned before. This is what we did for this project, where we question of issue of mediation and labor in the digital sphere. Here I put you a quote by the text that we started the course with, which was Agnes Rocamura text on mediatization and digital media, where she argued, and I'm quoting, that looking at mediatization in the field of fashion means looking at ways practices of fashion are articulated through the media and are dependent of the media for their articulation. So starting from this concept of mediatization, brought an interesting discussion on the way in which we, and with a student as well, we all consume fashion, especially looking at fashion shows online. We ask a student question like, where do the images you consume online come from? Specifically looking at catwalk pictures. Who produces them? How do they arrive on our computer screen? And what specific techniques, tasks, and conditions are at play in the presentation of these real-time images? Starting from student personal interest, experience, and a lack in the fashion studies literature, we developed a project in collaboration with a covering agency named In Digital Point TV, which is an agency created to shoot all international fashion weeks, and also that gives all their content to VOD.com. Over a time frame of 10 days, our students experienced, in a nutshell, a sort of field work in the making of a catwalk digital image. Had a glimpse on the exploration of the practice via what we can say ethnographic method. They had to explore the agency and they used and adopted a participatory observation to follow the photographers. They used film notes. They did interviews. As few students decided also to intern for the agency. They shadow catwalk photographer, runners, and even post-production image makers. The project exposed students to the entire process of production of a catwalk image, and all the results were presented both in an exhibition and then in a publication that also demanded them to historically contextualize this issue in relation to a previous form of mediatization of fashion. The project helps students to materialize and humanize discussion and readings in class and explore an overlooked production process in fashion media. And to use the words, actually, that was good, of Sadre Orafai. I highlighted here on the bottom this quote from her text, Recasting Fashion Image Production. It really helped the student to demystify, and I'm quoting her, the machinization of the fashion industry and show its rationality. End of the quote. This meant basically to unveil the entire process of production of a catwalk digital image, to reveal specific creative hierarchies, unknown working profiles, form of exploitation, new frontiers of creative labor, and of course, economic negotiation and commissions. So while the collaboration between the three classes helps to create an historical context and a very evident relation between theory, history, and practice, we also face problematics as students suffered the workload, which exceeded their expectation for the course, the many feedback sessions that we did, the difficulties of facing non-fixed hours of work, and difficulties in moving from a syllabus-based learning schedule to a more unexpected and, let's say, freestyle learning path dictated by the in-digital team, but also by the making of the exhibition. What was also interesting is that no student wanted to pursue a further working experience with the agency, although they had the possibility to do that. The second project that I want to talk about is titled Object in Trouble, which was a performance we constructed in collaboration with Palais Galliera at the Museum of Paris, Fashion Museum of Paris. The project emerged in the course Creating Fashion, and again was a mix of different courses, but the principal one was connected to the course taught by Laurent Cotta with my collaboration, and where we decided really to explore the increasing attention to issues of decolonization, institutional racism, and cultural appropriation in relation to both the fashion industry and fashion museums. Students were divided in 4 groups and were assigned to 4 different object artifacts. One had also a publication that may have today a problematic history in relation to issues of race, colonialism, or elitism. And this was due to the creators or to the owner use of the pieces, or simply to the context in which they were consumed or produced. Moving away, these are the 4 objects that we asked the student to work on. I mean, actually were selected amongst different objects that we initially selected. Moving away from the canonical interpretation patterns of museum, often based on celebrity culture, authorship, and myth creation, students had to work throughout the semester inside the different depot, but also were asked to create a critical and alternative interpretation of these 4 different pieces. Our aim was really to, rather than hide these problematic pieces in the archive, was really to kind of show their problematic nature. Besides studying the object for its material properties, students were asked to develop a performance, presenting through storytelling and interpretation of the object and show its potential in enabling issues of race, gender, and post-colonialism. The performance became a way to disrupt institutional knowledge and narratives. Students were asked to both challenge their way of looking at historiography and curating, but also learn a way to freeze the meaning of an object in museums, infecting its interpretation with subjective and even personal stories. For example, an interesting aspect was that the performance of this piece, which was a Chinese tunic, helped a student to share different cultural vision of what Chineseness could represent, both unpacking and expanding their and even our, as teacher, our knowledge about the code. The decision to adopt the performance, the use of student bodies, and their voices, to both ask them to read or experiment on public reading an object, displaying a document, and theoretical text, aimed towards what I could call a performative education, paraphrasing the concept of performative research developed by Asselman, and here you see his quote. To some extent, the performance object in trouble did not help the Palais Galliera to experiment new only ways, but it helped us also to understand how performative can be a performance as a learning process in fashion studies. So I just put you here some feedback by the student, and I just conclude saying that indeed this was an interesting experience in terms of reinvigorating the role of theory, but at the same time it also brought up to constantly question the feasibility and scope of this project. Besides the huge amount of work and labor, the idea of performative education may also fall in the risk of developing teaching activities, and industry-like collaboration may indeed push student learning, but also become an attractive form of education that may be symptomatic of a transformation of higher education into customer service practices, where education may be entering not simply creative industries, but more specifically also the industry of entertainment. In fact, the institutional demands to increase student admission, the demand to experiment with new pedagogical activities and participative education, and even social media presence, may push us to a new stage for educational practices, where all the elements that characterize fashion as a spectacle and the economy of the new may also be directly shape what fashion education will become in the future. Thanks.